Everyone in Block H thought he was harmless. The frail guy with trembling hands. The one who flinched whenever someone raised their voice. The inmate who always sat alone at dinner, stirring his food like he didn't know how to eat it. They called him Feather, because he looked like the wind could blow him over. The guards ignored him. The bullies used him as a training dummy. Even the warden forgot his name. But while everyone laughed at him, no one noticed the small pattern he carved into the wall every night. 1 scrape, 2, 3. Slow enough not to draw suspicion, precise enough to form a perfect line. They never paid attention to the bent cafeteria spoon tucked into his sleeve, or the fact that he always requested the same seat, the one closest to the ventilation shaft. Then came the night the alarms failed, the cameras glitched, the power flickered, and a guard, half asleep, noticed something odd. Feather's bed was empty, for the first time in 2 years. He called for backup, and when they peeled back the thin mattress, they found a tunnel beneath it. Layers of dust, concrete crumbs, and one impossibly polished spoon. But the real shock? The tunnel wasn't just an escape route. It led directly into the prison's restricted wing, the one holding a man everyone believed was untouchable. And carved into the final wall was a message only trained agents would understand. Mission Phase 2 complete. That was the moment they realized the weakest inmate in the prison was never an inmate at all. Stay with me until the end, because what this weak prisoner does next will expose a secret mission years in the making. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. The story of Agent Daniel Cross began 3 years before anyone at Millbrook Federal Penitentiary knew his name. While most people saw prison walls as barriers to freedom, Cross saw them as the perfect cover for the most dangerous undercover operation in federal history. His target wasn't freedom. It was Viktor Kozlov, a Russian arms dealer who had been laughing at the American justice system from behind the safety of maximum security walls. Kozlov had information about weapon shipments that could prevent terrorist attacks across 3 continents. The problem was simple. He refused to talk. Every interrogation technique had failed. Every deal had been rejected. Every attempt to flip him had backfired spectacularly. That's when the Bureau made a decision that would either be brilliant or completely insane. They would plant their best deep cover operative inside the same prison. Not as a guard, not as a lawyer, as an inmate. Cross had spent 15 years perfecting the art of becoming invisible. He had infiltrated drug cartels by posing as a junkie. He had brought down arms dealers by pretending to be a weapons buyer. He had dismantled human trafficking rings by convincing criminals he was one of them. But this mission was different. This time, he couldn't just disappear when things got dangerous. He would be locked in a concrete box with some of the most violent criminals in the country, and his only protection would be the perfect performance of weakness. The transformation began months before his staged arrest. Cross lost 40 pounds, deliberately damaging his posture and developing a nervous twitch that made him appear mentally unstable. He studied the body language of trauma victims, learning to flinch at sudden movements and stutter when confronted. His backstory was crafted with meticulous precision. Daniel Featherstone, convicted of embezzling pension funds from a small charity. A white-collar criminal with no violent history, no gang affiliations, and no survival skills. The kind of man who would be eaten alive in a place like Millbrook. The arrest was staged perfectly. Cross allowed himself to be caught with falsified financial documents, playing the role of a bumbling accountant who got in over his head. The trial was real enough to fool anyone investigating his background, complete with fake witnesses and manufactured evidence. When the prison transport van pulled through Millbrook's gates, Cross felt the weight of every decision that had led him to this moment. The other prisoners sized him up immediately. Weak, scared, easy prey, perfect. His first week was carefully choreographed humiliation. He let bigger inmates steal his food, his blankets, even his shoes. He cowered when guards yelled at him. He cried himself to sleep loud enough for his cellmate to hear. Every action was calculated to reinforce the image of a broken man who posed no threat to anyone. But while other inmates saw weakness, Cross was conducting the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation of his career. He memorized guard schedules, noting which officers were lazy, which ones were corrupt, and which ones actually cared about doing their jobs properly. He mapped every corridor, every blind spot, every potential escape route, not because he planned to use them, but because understanding the prison's layout was essential to his real mission. The cafeteria became his observation post. Sitting alone at his corner table, stirring his food like he didn't understand what it was, Cross cataloged every conversation, every alliance, every power structure within the prison hierarchy. But most importantly, he studied Viktor Kozlov. The Russian arms dealer held court at the center table every meal, surrounded by a rotating cast of admirers, enforcers, and wannabes. Kozlov was everything Cross pretended not to be. Confident, dangerous, completely in control of his environment. Getting close to him would require more than just proximity. It would require earning his trust. And men like Kozlov didn't trust anyone, especially not weak, pathetic inmates who looked like they belonged in an accounting office rather than a maximum security prison. That's when Cross developed the plan that would define the next 2 years of his life. He wouldn't approach Kozlov directly. Instead, he would create a reason for Kozlov to approach him. The bent spoon wasn't just a tool. It was a message. Every night, after lights out, Cross worked on his masterpiece. Using the damaged utensil he had carefully bent during his 3rd week, he began carving something that would eventually catch the attention of the most paranoid criminal in the prison. The work was painstakingly slow. Each scrape had to be silent enough to avoid detection by guards making their rounds. Each line had to be precise enough to form part of a larger pattern that would mean nothing to most observers, but everything to someone with Kozlov's background. Cross was carving a map, not of the prison, but of weapons cache locations across Eastern Europe that only someone with deep intelligence connections could possibly know. The information was real, gathered from previous operations, and declassified just enough to make it valuable without compromising ongoing missions. But to anyone looking at the wall, it appeared to be the nervous scratching of a mentally unstable inmate. Months passed before Kozlov noticed anything unusual about the weak man in the corner. Cross had become part of the prison's furniture, so consistently pathetic that even the guards stopped paying attention to him. But criminals like Kozlov survived by noticing details others missed. And one evening, while walking past Feather's table, something caught his eye. The weak inmate was drawing the same symbols in his mashed potatoes that had been appearing on the wall of cell block H. Symbols that looked suspiciously like coordinates. For the first time in 2 years, Viktor Kozlov found himself genuinely curious about the man everyone called Feather, because those coordinates led to places that officially didn't exist on any map. Places where weapons disappeared and reappeared across international borders. Places that only someone with very specific clearance would ever know about. Cross felt the Russians' eyes on him and knew the real game was finally beginning. After months of careful preparation, he had Kozlov's attention. Now came the most dangerous part of the entire operation, making Viktor Kozlov believe that the weakest inmate in the prison might actually be the most dangerous man he had ever met. The first contact happened during rec time on a Tuesday afternoon. Kozlov approached Cross's usual spot near the basketball court, where the weak inmate sat reading a tattered paperback novel about suburban housewives. The perfect cover for a man who supposedly knew nothing about international weapons trafficking. "You dropped this?" Kozlov's accent was thick, deliberately so. He held up a small piece of paper with coordinates scribbled across it in Cross's handwriting. Cross looked up with the same nervous expression he had perfected over months of practice. His hands trembled as he reached for the paper, but his eyes never left Kozlov's face. "Oh, thank you," I was wondering where that went. Interesting numbers, Kozlov said, settling onto the bench beside him. Other inmates immediately gave them space. Nobody sat next to the Russian unless invited. Looks like map coordinates. Cross's performance was flawless. He glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might be listening. It's nothing important. Just something I remembered from before. Before what? Before I got stupid and ended up in here. Cross closed his book and fidgeted with the pages. I used to work with numbers all day. Sometimes my brain just remembers random things. Kozlov studied him carefully. This close, Cross could see the intelligence burning behind the Russian's cold eyes. This was a man who had survived decades in the arms trade by reading people better than most psychologists read textbooks. What kind of work? Kozlov pressed. Accounting, boring stuff, pension funds, insurance claims, that sort of thing. Cross let his voice crack slightly on the last words. I thought I was being clever, skimming a little here and there. Turns out I wasn't as smart as I thought. The conversation lasted only 5 minutes, but Cross knew he had passed the first test. Kozlov walked away without another word. But the seed had been planted. The weak inmate who drew coordinates in his food and carved maps into walls wasn't completely random after all. Over the following weeks, their interactions became more frequent. Kozlov would find excuses to sit near Cross during meals, asking casual questions about his background, his family, his life before prison. Cross answered every question with the perfect blend of nervous honesty and carefully planted inconsistencies. He mentioned working late nights at the accounting firm, dealing with international clients whose names he couldn't quite remember. He talked about processing payments for shipping companies that moved cargo to places he had never heard of. Small details that meant nothing to most people but everything to someone in Kozlov's line of work. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later during a lockdown that trapped them both in the library. A fight had broken out in the yard, and all inmates were confined to their current locations until order was restored. Cross sat at his usual table, pretending to read while actually listening to every conversation in the room. Kozlov approached with a chess set, the kind of power move that established dominance while appearing friendly. You play? Cross looked at the board like it might explode. Not really. I mean, I know how the pieces move, but I was never any good at strategy. Strategy is just seeing patterns others miss, Kozlov said, setting up the white pieces. Same with accounting, I think. Numbers tell stories if you know how to read them. They played for 2 hours while the lockdown continued. Cross deliberately made amateur mistakes, losing pieces through obvious blunders while occasionally making moves that revealed deeper understanding of the game than his persona should possess. Kozlov noticed everything. When Cross sacrificed his queen to protect a seemingly worthless pawn, the Russian's eyebrows raised slightly. When Cross positioned his remaining pieces in a formation that created unexpected defensive possibilities, Kozlov leaned back in his chair. For someone who is not good at strategy, you make interesting choices, Kozlov observed. Cross blushed and knocked over his own king in apparent embarrassment. I guess I watch too many movies. I don't really know what I'm doing. But Kozlov was studying the board position, recognizing patterns that shouldn't exist in the mind of a bumbling accountant. The defensive formation Cross had created was identical to tactics used by Soviet military strategists during the Cold War, the kind of information that wouldn't be taught in accounting school or found in popular movies. That evening, Kozlov made his first real move in what had become a chess match, far more complex than the one they had played in the library. He sent one of his lieutenants to Cross's cell with a simple message. Boss wants to know if you're interested in making some real money. Cross's cellmate, a drug dealer named Martinez, who had been counting down days until his release, nearly choked on his toothpaste when he heard the invitation. Everyone in Millbrook knew what it meant when Viktor Kozlov offered someone an opportunity. You either became very rich or very dead, and the margin for error was non-existent. What did you tell him? Martinez whispered after the messenger left. Cross continued brushing his teeth with the same nervous precision he brought to every daily routine. I told him I'd think about it. You told Viktor Kozlov you'd think about it? Martinez stared at him like he had announced plans to sprout wings and fly out through the cell bars. Man, you don't tell that guy you'll think about anything. You say yes, sir, thank you, sir, and pray you don't mess up whatever he wants you to do. But Cross knew exactly what he was doing. Kozlov was a predator who had survived by being smarter than his prey. Appearing too eager would trigger every alarm bell in the Russian's paranoid mind. The weak accountant, who needed time to consider an offer, was far more believable than one who jumped at the chance. 3 days later, Cross approached Kozlov's table during dinner. His hands shook as he set down his tray, and his voice barely carried over the noise of the cafeteria. I've been thinking about what you said, about making money. Kozlov didn't look up from his meal. And I might know some things that could be useful, from my old job. Cross glanced around nervously. But I don't want to get in more trouble than I'm already in. What kind of things? Cross leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Kozlov could hear. Remember those shipping companies I mentioned? The ones with the weird cargo manifests? I think some of them weren't exactly legal. For the first time since arriving at Millbrook, Viktor Kozlov smiled. Not the cold, calculating expression he wore during business negotiations, but something that almost resembled genuine amusement. Tell me more about these cargo manifests, my nervous friend. Cross spent the next hour spinning a carefully constructed web of half-truths and strategic revelations. He described shipping routes that actually existed, cargo containers that had really been intercepted by federal agents, and payment systems that genuine arms dealers had used before being shut down by international law enforcement. Every detail was accurate enough to verify, but incomplete enough to make Kozlov hungry for more information. Cross painted himself as an unwitting accomplice who had processed payments without understanding their true purpose, a small cog in a machine too large for him to comprehend. By the time dinner ended, Kozlov had made a decision that would change everything. The weak accountant sitting across from him wasn't just a potential asset. He might be the key to rebuilding the network that federal agents had spent years destroying. I think we should continue this conversation somewhere more private, Kozlov said, standing from the table. Tomorrow night after count, I will arrange for you to visit my cell. Cross nodded meekly, but inside, every instinct he had developed over 15 years of undercover work was screaming warnings. Visiting Kozlov's cell would mean entering the most dangerous territory in the prison, surrounded by loyal enforcers who would kill him without hesitation if they suspected deception. But it also meant getting closer to his target than any law enforcement officer had managed in over 3 years. The weak inmate who everyone ignored was about to walk into the heart of Viktor Kozlov's operation, and once he was inside, the real mission could finally begin. The next 24 hours crawled by like molasses in winter. Cross maintained his routine with mechanical precision, shuffling to meals with the same defeated posture, flinching when guards barked orders, sitting alone while other inmates formed their usual clusters of conversation and conspiracy. But beneath the surface, his mind was calculating every possible scenario for what would happen in Kozlov's cell. The Russian wasn't known for casual social visits. Men who entered his private domain either emerged as trusted allies or they didn't emerge at all. Cross had studied the layout of Kozlov's cell block through months of careful observation. The Russian had managed to secure a corner cell, the kind of premium real estate that came with extra privacy and strategic advantages. 2 loyal enforcers occupied the neighboring cells, creating a buffer zone that kept unwanted visitors at a safe distance. Getting inside would be the easy part. Getting out alive would depend entirely on how convincing his performance proved to be. That evening, as the final count concluded and cell doors locked for the night, Cross heard the distinctive sound of metal sliding against metal. His door was opening again, which should have been impossible according to normal prison protocols. But Viktor Kozlov had stopped following normal protocols years ago. The escort arrived without fanfare. 2 men Cross recognized as Kozlov's inner circle, both carrying themselves with the casual confidence of people who had never lost a fight. They didn't speak, simply gestured for him to follow. The walk through the darkened corridors felt like a funeral procession. Emergency lighting cast long shadows that seemed to reach for Cross as he shuffled between his escorts, maintaining the nervous energy that had become second nature after months of practice. Other inmates pressed themselves against their cell doors, watching through the narrow windows as the weak accountant was led deeper into territory most of them would never see. Some whispered prayers for him. Others placed bets on whether he would survive the night. Kozlov's cell was exactly what Cross had expected, twice the size of a normal cell, furnished with items that shouldn't exist in any prison. A leather chair that looked like it belonged in a corporate boardroom, a small refrigerator humming quietly in the corner, books lined up on shelves with the precision of a military formation, and weapons, not obvious ones, but Cross's trained eye immediately catalogued 3 items within reach that could kill a man in seconds. A letter opener that was definitely not standard prison issue, a paperweight heavy enough to crush a skull. Even the decorative chess set could become lethal in the right hands. "Please sit." Kozlov gestured to a simple wooden chair positioned directly across from his leather throne. The positioning was deliberate, putting Cross at a psychological disadvantage while ensuring he remained within striking distance. The door closed behind them with a sound like a coffin lid slamming shut. "You look nervous, my friend," Kozlov observed, pouring 2 glasses of what appeared to be genuine vodka from a bottle that definitely hadn't come from the prison commissary. "Perhaps this will help calm your nerves." Cross accepted the glass with trembling hands, though the trembling was now only partially an act. Even with all his training, sitting across from one of the most dangerous arms dealers in the world while pretending to be a bumbling accountant required nerves of steel wrapped in a performance of absolute weakness. "I don't usually drink," Cross stammered, taking a small sip and immediately coughing as the alcohol burned his throat. "This is really strong. Russian vodka. The real thing. Not the watered-down garbage they serve in American bars." Kozlov settled back in his chair, studying Cross like a scientist, examining an interesting specimen. "Now tell me more about these shipping manifests you mentioned. I want to know everything." For the next hour, Cross wove the most complex web of deception of his career. He described fictional accounting procedures with enough technical detail to sound authentic. He mentioned real shipping companies that had been shut down by federal investigations, but attributed their downfall to bad luck rather than law enforcement action. Most importantly, he painted a picture of himself as someone who had stumbled into illegal activity through ignorance rather than intent. A useful idiot who had processed payments without asking questions, handled paperwork without understanding its significance, and noticed patterns without recognizing their true meaning. "The thing is," Cross said, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his story, "I kept copies of everything. I know it was probably stupid, but I was always worried about getting audited. I wanted backup documentation for every transaction, every transfer, every payment authorization." Kozlov's eyes sharpened with interest. "You kept copies? What kind of copies?" "Bank routing numbers, account information, contact details for shipping coordinators, names of cargo inspectors who seemed to look the other way when certain containers came through customs." Cross paused, as if realizing he might have said too much. "I mean, I didn't know at the time that anything was wrong. I just thought some of the paperwork looked unusual." The Russian leaned forward, his casual demeanor shifting into something more predatory. "And where are these copies now?" "Hidden, in a place where nobody would think to look." Cross met Kozlov's gaze for the first time that evening, allowing a flicker of cunning to show through his nervous facade. "I may look like an idiot, but I'm not completely stupid. I knew that information might be valuable someday." This was the moment Cross had been building toward for months, the revelation that would transform him from a pathetic victim into a potential asset worth protecting. The weak accountant who possessed information that could rebuild networks, restore connections, and generate millions in illegal profits. Kozlov was silent for a long moment, processing the implications of what he had just heard. Then, slowly, he began to smile. Not the cold expression Cross had seen before, but something that actually reached his eyes. "My nervous friend, I think we are going to work very well together." "You really think so?" Cross allowed hope to creep into his voice, the desperate eagerness of a broken man grasping for any chance at redemption. "I mean, I know I'm not exactly criminal material, but I want to make things right. I want to prove I'm not completely useless." "Useless? No, my friend. You are many things, but useless is not one of them." Kozlov stood and walked to a small safe hidden behind a false panel in the wall. Cross memorized every detail of the combination as the Russian's fingers moved across the dial. "In fact, I think you may be exactly what I have been looking for." From the safe, Kozlov withdrew a thick folder filled with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be financial records. He spread them across a small table, creating a display that would have made any federal prosecutor weep with joy. "You see, my business has been disrupted recently. Former partners have become unreliable. Shipping routes have been compromised. Financial networks have been exposed." Kozlov's voice carried the weight of genuine frustration. "I need someone with your particular skills to help me rebuild what has been lost." Cross stared at the documents, his eyes widening with what appeared to be amazement, but was actually professional excitement. The folder contained enough evidence to dismantle arms trafficking operations across 3 continents. Bank account numbers, shipping schedules, contact information for corrupt officials, and detailed records of weapons sales that violated dozens of international treaties. It was everything the Bureau had been trying to gather for over 5 years, spread across a table in a maximum security prison cell. "This is incredible," Cross whispered, his voice filled with awe that wasn't entirely fabricated. "I had no idea the scale was this massive. And this is only a small portion of what once existed," Kozlov replied. "With the right help, with someone who understands numbers and documentation, it could all be restored, improved even." Cross looked up from the documents, his expression a perfect mixture of excitement and terror. "You want me to help you rebuild all of this? I want you to help me build something better than what existed before, something more efficient, more secure, more profitable." Kozlov began gathering the documents, returning them to their hiding place. "But first, I need to know that you can be trusted completely." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Cross understood exactly what Kozlov was really saying. The Russian was offering him a partnership, but partnerships in the arms trade were sealed with blood, not handshakes. Proving trustworthiness would require actions that crossed lines no federal agent was supposed to cross. "What kind of proof do you need?" Cross asked, though he was already dreading the answer. Kozlov's smile returned, colder than before. "Tomorrow, we begin your education. You will learn how my organization really operates, and you will demonstrate your commitment to our mutual success." Cross nodded slowly, knowing that his real test was just beginning. Getting close to Kozlov had been the easy part. Now came the challenge that would determine whether his mission succeeded or whether Agent Daniel Cross would disappear forever into the identity of a weak accountant who had gotten in over his head. "I won't let you down," Cross said, and for the first time since arriving at Millbrook, he meant every word. Because failure wasn't just about compromising the mission anymore. Failure meant that thousands of weapons would continue flowing to terrorists, criminals, and anyone else willing to pay Kozlov's prices. As the escorts led him back through the darkened corridors to his cell, Cross began planning the most dangerous phase of his undercover operation. Tomorrow, he would have to prove himself worthy of Viktor Kozlov's trust, and that proof would require him to become everything he had spent his career fighting against. The next morning brought news that would shake Millbrook to its foundation. Viktor Kozlov was gone. Not escaped, not transferred, not dead. Simply gone. as if he had vanished into thin air during the night shift change. The discovery came at 6 a.m. sharp when guards arrived for morning count. Kozlov's cell door was locked from the outside, exactly as it should have been. His bed showed signs of recent use. His personal belongings remained untouched, but the most dangerous arms dealer in federal custody had somehow disappeared without triggering a single alarm or leaving behind any trace of how he had managed the impossible. What the guards found instead was a message carved into the concrete wall with surgical precision. Not the crude scratching of a desperate prisoner, but the clean, professional work of someone who understood exactly what they were doing. 8 words that would send shockwaves through every intelligence agency in Washington. Package delivered. Extraction complete. Phase 3 initiated. Warden Morrison had seen everything during his 30-year career in corrections. Riots that left blood on the walls. Escape attempts that turned into deadly manhunts. Corruption scandals that destroyed careers and ruined lives. But he had never encountered anything that made his hands shake the way they did when he read that message. Within 6 hours, Millbrook Federal Penitentiary was crawling with federal agents, intelligence analysts, and specialists whose job descriptions were classified above Morrison's clearance level. They arrived in unmarked vehicles, spoke in code words, and transformed his prison into something that looked more like a military operation than a correctional facility. The investigation began with a single question that seemed simple but proved impossible to answer. How had Viktor Kozlov disappeared from the most secure wing of a maximum security prison without leaving behind any evidence of his escape route? The answer lay in the tunnel that guards had discovered beneath Daniel Cross's mattress. But that tunnel told a story that defied everything they thought they understood about prison security, federal operations, and the man they had known as Feather. Agent Sarah Chen from the Bureau's Special Operations Division stood in Cross's empty cell, studying the entrance to what would later be classified as one of the most sophisticated extraction operations in agency history. The tunnel itself was a masterpiece of engineering disguised as the desperate scratching of a mentally unstable inmate. Every scrape had been calculated to remove exactly the right amount of concrete without compromising structural integrity. The debris had been carefully distributed through the prison's ventilation system, carried away one handful at a time during Cross's daily walks. The sound dampening had been achieved through a technique that required knowledge of acoustic engineering far beyond what any accountant should possess. But the tunnel was just the beginning. Chen followed its path through blueprints that showed every pipe, every electrical conduit, every structural support beam in the building. Cross had navigated around obstacles that weren't marked on any publicly available documents, avoiding detection systems that existed only in classified security reports. The tunnel emerged in the restricted wing through a maintenance access panel that should have been impossible to reach without triggering motion sensors. Yet Cross had somehow bypassed security measures that cost taxpayers millions of dollars to install. Agent Daniel Cross was never seen again after that night. The Bureau's records were sealed, his identity buried under so many layers of classification that even his handlers would forget his real name. But Viktor Kozlov, the arms dealer everyone thought was untouchable, spent the rest of his life in a facility that made Millbrook look like a vacation resort. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone thinks is harmless. Cross proved that true strength isn't about looking tough or acting intimidating. It's about patience, precision, and the discipline to play a role so perfectly that even your enemies invite you into their inner circle. The weak accountant with trembling hands had accomplished what years of interrogation couldn't. He didn't just capture Viktor Kozlov. He dismantled an entire network that threatened lives across 3 continents, all with a bent spoon and the patience to carve freedom one scrape at a time.